A reclusive Korean shipping tycoon, a man whose vessels carry the lifeblood of global trade, walked into his own portside restaurant looking like a man who had lost everything. He was ignored, insulted, and targeted for a theft that would scale into the millions. But just as the trap was about to spring, a composed waitress leaned in and pressed a small card into his palm. Han Woo-jin glanced at the handwritten numbers and felt a coldness settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. It wasn't a message of pity, it was the digital key to an empire's betrayal. That single card stopped him from walking away and prepared him to dismantle a criminal web from the inside. But what exactly was written on the back of that card? The boots Han Woo-jin wore were caked in the salt and grime of the Incheon docks, the very place where he had spent his youth hauling crates before he owned the ships that carried them. They were a stark contrast to the Italian leather loafers he usually wore in the Han Global boardroom. He had pulled them from a forgotten crate in his garage, a relic of a past life he was about to weaponize. His chief of security stood in the shadows of the alleyway, his hand hovering near his holster. "Sir, the local police are on the payroll. If this goes south, we are 10 minutes from backup." Woo-jin adjusted his torn collar, his eyes wary but sharp. "In this city, the law follows the money. I need to see where that money is going before it disappears forever." The tip had come not through a letter, but through a series of ghost invoices, checks for million-dollar corporate dinners at the Gilded Anchor that didn't match the inventory of the kitchen. Someone was using his flagship restaurant to move a fortune across borders. The quarterly reports called it operational overhead. Woo-jin called it theft. He knew that to catch a thief who hides in the light, he had to become a man no one bothered to look at. The heavy glass doors of the Gilded Anchor hissed open, releasing a wave of chilled, jasmine-scented air that felt like a slap against Han Woo-jin's weathered face. He stepped onto the polished marble floor, his salt-caked boots leaving a faint, gray smear on the pristine surface. Around him, the restaurant hummed with the discreet clinking of silver against bone china and the low, melodic murmur of the city's elite. It was a symphony of wealth he had conducted for decades, yet today, he was merely a discordant note. Woo-jin adjusted the collar of his faded, oil-stained jacket. The fabric was stiff, smelling of brine and old rust, the scent of his youth. As he stood in the foyer, the flickering amber light of the grand chandeliers caught the dirt smeared across his knuckles, making him look like a shadow that had accidentally wandered into a dream. For a moment, the sights and sounds of the luxury dining room faded, replaced by the ghost echoes of the Incheon docks. He could almost feel the phantom weight of heavy iron crates on his shoulders and hear the rhythmic, guttural shouts of the longshoremen battling the tide. He had built an empire so that he would never have to smell that salt again, yet here he was, returning to it as a weapon. A group of diners in tailored silk passed him, their conversation dying mid-sentence as they instinctively veered away, their expressions curdling into masks of refined disgust. Woo-jin didn't flinch. He watched them with a wary, predatory stillness, his eyes sharp beneath the grime. He wasn't looking at the decor or the menu, he was looking for the rot he knew was festering beneath the gold leaf. At the edge of the room, near the towering mahogany host stand, Marcus Vane stood with his arms crossed, his suit so sharp it looked like it could draw blood. His gaze raked over Woo-jin's rugged frame, not with the curiosity one might afford a guest, but with the cold, systematic appraisal of a man looking at a nuisance to be discarded. Behind him, the restaurant stretched out in a sea of white linen and sparkling crystal, a kingdom Marcus believed he ruled. Woo-jin felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old survival instinct of the dock worker rising to meet the tycoon's cold fury. He knew what Marcus saw, a man with no value, a ghost from the piers who had no business breathing the same filtered air as the Anchor's patrons. But as Woo-jin took his first heavy step forward, his eyes remained fixed on the manager. He wasn't there to be served, he was there to witness the true face of his legacy, even if it meant being treated like the dirt he had used to hide his identity. Marcus Vane didn't move from his post, but the air around him seemed to thicken with a performative disdain. With a flick of two manicured fingers, he signaled a junior busboy, refusing to even grant Woo-jin the dignity of a verbal greeting. Table 22, Marcus drawled, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the neighboring diners heard the dismissal. And keep him out of the light. We have a reputation to maintain, even if the guest doesn't. Wu Jin was led past the plush velvet booths and the sweeping views of the harbor, deeper into the bowels of the restaurant where the scent of jasmine gave way to the harsh, industrial smell of floor wax and dish detergent. Table 22 was a wobbly, two-top island shoved against the swinging double doors of the kitchen. Every few seconds, the doors burst open with a rush of heat and the rhythmic clatter of shouting chefs, nearly clipping Wu Jin's shoulder. It was a table designed to make a person feel like an obstacle rather than a guest. He sat, the worn leather of his jacket creaking against the chair. The affluent diners nearby adjusted their chairs, turning their backs to him as if poverty were a contagious shadow. For 10 minutes, the staff moved past him in a blur of synchronized motion, their eyes carefully tracking everywhere except at the man in the salt-stained boots. He was a ghost at his own feast, an invisible man in a house built on his name. Then, the kitchen doors swung open with a softer touch. Camille Johnson approached, her uniform crisp and her movements deliberate. While the other servers carried an air of frantic elitism, she moved with a quiet, grounded authority that halted the chaos around her. She didn't look at his torn sleeves with the pity that insults, nor with the judgment that wounds. She simply looked at him. She placed a heavy crystal glass of water on the table, not the chipped plastic cup Marcus had hissed for her to use, but the fine glassware reserved for the vintage pairings. The ice clinked softly, a clear, sharp sound in the humid corner. As she poured, she leaned in just enough to create a small, private sanctuary amidst the noise. "The air is heavy tonight, sir," she said, her voice a calm, low alto that didn't waver. "Drink this. It's a long walk back to the piers." There was no sneer in her tone, no hidden mockery in her eyes. For the first time since he had crossed the threshold, Wu Jin felt the prickly heat of his anger begin to cool. He looked up at her, seeing the fatigue behind her professional mask, and realized that in this room of millions, she was the only one who truly saw the man behind the rags. He took a sip of the water, the cold clarity of it matching the sudden focus in his mind. The trap was set, but he had finally found an ally who didn't even know she was being recruited. The heavy kitchen doors hissed shut behind Camille, but the silence she sought was nowhere to be found. Instead, the air in the narrow server station felt charged with a frantic, rhythmic tapping. Marcus was huddled over the central management terminal, his body angled to shield the screen from the rest of the room. Usually, he loathed touching the hardware, considering the logistics of service to be beneath him, but now his fingers flew across the glass with a desperate, practiced speed. Camille stepped toward the coffee station, keeping her head down, her eyes tracking the reflection in the polished chrome of the espresso machine. She saw the terminal's blue light dancing across Marcus's sharp features, turning his skin a ghostly, sickly hue. He wasn't processing an order for wine or extra appetizers. The interface he had opened was the high-level administrative bypass, a screen she had only seen twice in 5 years. She moved closer, reaching for a stack of clean saucers just feet away from him. From this angle, the digital ink was visible. Marcus wasn't just adjusting a bill, he was building a phantom. He had opened a guest profile for Table 22, the homeless man's table, and was tethering it to a series of encrypted corporate accounts. Camille's breath hitched. On the screen, a massive figure flickered into existence, $1,200,000. It was labeled as a port logistics consultation fee. With a few more rapid strokes, Marcus routed the payment through a shell company in the Cayman Islands, using Han Woo-jin's temporary guest ID as the domestic point of origin. To any auditor, it would look like a rugged stranger had walked into the restaurant and authorized $1 million transfer before vanishing back into the piers. It was the perfect ghost transaction, a fortune laundered through a man who looked like he couldn't afford a bus ticket. Marcus hit the final confirmation, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. The terminal gave a soft, triumphant chime, and he quickly cleared the screen, returning it to the standard floor plan. He turned, nearly colliding with Camille. His eyes narrowed, searching her face for any sign of comprehension, but she had already mastered the art of looking like she saw nothing at all. "Get back out there, Camille," he snapped, his voice tight with an adrenaline she now understood. "And make sure our guest at table 22 doesn't leave until I personally bring him his check. I want to make sure he remembers his visit to the Gilded Anchor." Camille nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew that if she walked back out there and did nothing, the man in the salt-stained boots would become the fall guy for a crime that would echo across the shipping industry. She looked at the terminal, then at the kitchen doors, realizing the weight of the secret she now carried was heavier than any tray she had ever lifted. The locker room was a narrow, windowless corridor that smelled of industrial lavender and the cold, metallic tang of anxiety. Camille stood before her locker, her fingers trembling as she pulled a crumpled envelope from beneath her spare apron. The bright red lettering of the foreclosure notice seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights, a countdown clock marking the final days of her family's community center. That building was more than bricks and mortar, it was the heartbeat of her neighborhood, the place where her mother had taught and where her brother now studied. If she lost this job, the center would be swallowed by developers before the month was out. She leaned her forehead against the cool steel of the locker door, the ghost of Marcus's smirk burned into her retinas. Crossing a man like Marcus Vane wasn't just a professional risk, it was a death sentence for her future. Marcus was a man woven into the very fabric of the city's power structure, a man who boasted of playing golf with the police commissioner and dining with the district attorney. He could ensure she never worked in this city again with a single phone call. He had spent years reminding her that she was replaceable, a cog in a machine that he owned and operated. The weight of the secret she had seen on the terminal felt like a physical burden, a debt she hadn't asked for but was now forced to pay. She thought of the man at table 22, sitting in the shadows of the kitchen doors, his hands rough and his spirit underestimated. Marcus was betting on her silence, banking on the fact that her poverty made her predictable. He believed her need for a paycheck would always outweigh her need for justice. A sharp knock on the locker room door startled her. "Camille. Vane is looking for you," a voice called out. "He says the guest is ready for his check." She shoved the red-inked notice back into her locker and slammed the door shut. The sound echoed like a gavel in the small space. Her heart raced, the internal conflict tearing at her. On one side was the safety of her silence, the chance to keep her head down, keep her job, and struggle through another month of debt. On the other was the card she had scribbled on in the server station, the evidence of $1 million betrayal. As she adjusted her uniform and smoothed her hair, Camille looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror taped to the door. She saw the exhaustion, but beneath it, she saw a spark of the woman her mother had raised, a woman who knew that some debts could never be paid with money. To save her community, she needed this job, but to save herself, she couldn't let Marcus win. She stepped out into the hallway, her decision made, walking toward the dining room not as a waitress, but as a witness. Camille stepped back into the dining room, her movements fluid and practiced despite the roar of adrenaline in her ears. She carried a small silver tray, her fingers gripping the edge until her knuckles turned white. As she approached table 22, she could feel Marcus's gaze drilling into her back from the host stand, his eyes tracking her every move like a hawk over a field. She knew he was waiting for the kill, waiting for her to deliver the final bill that would cement his theft. Wu Jin sat in the flickering shadow of the kitchen door, his expression unreadable beneath the grime. He had finished his meager meal, the plate pushed aside with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen much better and much worse. Camille reached for the empty glass, her hand steady as she began to clear the table. "I hope everything was to your satisfaction, sir," she said, her voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, the perfect mask of a professional waitress. As she leaned forward to gather the napkins, she pulled a small, white, complimentary card from her pocket, the kind used for guest feedback. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked like a standard service gesture. But as her hand moved beneath the fold of the white linen cloth, she pressed the card into Wu Jin's palm. Their fingers touched for a fleeting second, the rough, calloused skin of the tycoon meeting the cold, trembling hand of the witness. She felt him stiffen, his sharp eyes flicking to hers in a moment of silent, intense communication. On the back of that card, in tiny, hurried script, she had scribbled the transaction ID, the $1.2 million figure, and the alphanumeric string of the offshore account she had memorized from the terminal. It was a fragment of code that held the weight of an entire empire. "There is a small detail on the back regarding our special services," she whispered, the words barely a breath against the ambient noise of the restaurant. She pulled back, the tray now balanced on her hip, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't stay to watch him read it. She couldn't afford to. As she walked away, she felt the shift in the air behind her. The man at the table hadn't moved, but the atmosphere had changed. The rugged immigrant was gone, in his place sat a hunter who finally had his target in sight. Camille didn't look back at Marcus. She kept her eyes forward, knowing that she had just lit a fuse that would either light her way out of debt or blow her entire world apart. Wu Jin felt the weight of the bill folder in his hand, a thin piece of leather that now carried a burden far heavier than paper. He moved with a slow, deliberate calmness, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a single, crumpled dollar bill. He smoothed it out against the table with his thumb, the green ink stark against the white linen, and placed it squarely in the center of the silver tray. Marcus Vane had been hovering just out of reach, waiting for this exact moment. He moved in like a predator sensing a kill, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor. He didn't just take the tray, he seized it, holding it aloft as if he were displaying a piece of evidence at a crime scene. $1? Marcus's voice rang out, projected with the precision of a stage actor to ensure every affluent diner in the room turned their head. "You sit in this establishment, you take up space in a room where men of consequence conduct the world's business, and you offer a single dollar?" The hum of the restaurant died instantly. The clinking of silverware ceased, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed against Wu Jin's back. Marcus took a step forward, his crossed arms a wall of tailored fabric and arrogance. "This is exactly what I expected," Marcus sneered, his face reddening with a performative fury. "This isn't just an insult to the service, it is a lack of class that borders on the criminal. You walk in here looking like the trash from the docks, and you prove it by acting like it." A few diners chuckled, a cold, brittle sound, while others watched with a voyeuristic thrill, enjoying the public execution of a man who didn't belong. Marcus leaned down, his voice dropping to a harsh, jagged whisper that still carried to the neighboring tables. "You think you can play at being a guest? You're a parasite, taking a seat from someone who actually contributes to this city. People like you don't understand the value of $1, because you've never earned anything in your life." Wu Jin sat perfectly still. He didn't lower his head or look away. He watched Marcus with a chilling, predatory focus, his hand resting over the small card Camille had slipped him, the card that was currently burning a hole through his pocket. He could feel the eyes of the entire room on him, a sea of judgment and misplaced superiority. Marcus believed he was the one in control, the one holding the power, unaware that he was standing on a trapdoor that Wu Jin was seconds away from opening. "Is that all?" Wu Jin asked quietly. His voice was low, but it possessed a resonant authority that seemed to cut through Marcus's bravado like a blade through silk. It wasn't the voice of a beggar, it was the voice of a man who was about to bring the entire ceiling down. Wu Jin's stillness was absolute, a stark contrast to Marcus's frantic, performative energy. He didn't rise to meet the manager's height, he simply sat there, letting the silence expand until the diners in the front row began to shift uncomfortably. The air in the room felt brittle, as if the slightest sound might shatter the carefully curated luxury of the gilded anchor. "Is it the amount that offends you, Mr. Vane?" Wu Jin asked, his voice steady and deceptively soft. "Or is it the person offering it?" Marcus let out a short, jagged laugh, looking toward the affluent onlookers for approval. "The person, the amount, it's the same thing. You're a man who doesn't belong here, trying to pay for excellence with pocket change. You should be grateful I haven't had you dragged out to the docks where you came from. Wu Jin slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out the small card Camille had slipped him. He placed it on the table next to the $1 bill. It's interesting you mention the value of money, he said, finally looking Marcus in the eye. The warmth of the rugged immigrant had vanished, replaced by a gaze that was cold, analytical, and terrifyingly sharp. Because by my count, you've been quite busy with my finances tonight. Marcus's smirk didn't fail immediately, but his eyes flickered toward the card. What are you talking about? I'm curious, Wu Jin continued, leaning forward just enough to invade the manager's personal space. In your professional opinion, why is a $1 tip an insult to your staff's dignity, but a $1.2 million management fee routed to a shell company in the Cayman Islands is considered acceptable service? The blood drained from Marcus's face so quickly it left him looking like a paper sketch of the man he had been seconds ago. The arrogant tilt of his head vanished. He glanced at the card. The alphanumeric string of the offshore account was visible even from where he stood. It was the digital fingerprint of his crime, handwritten by a waitress he had considered part of the furniture. I don't know what you're talking about, Marcus stammered, his voice losing its stage presence and turning thin and reedy. That's a lie. You're delusional. Security. Don't bother, Wu Jin said, the authority in his voice now so absolute that the room went cold. He pulled a slim, encrypted smartphone from the inner lining of his ragged jacket, a device that cost more than Marcus's car. I've been watching the terminal from here for the last 10 minutes. The transaction is already being traced back to your personal login. I didn't come here to eat, Marcus. I came here to see if the rumors were true. The diners, once eager participants in the shaming, now watched in stunned silence. They realized they weren't witnessing a manager discipline a vagrant, they were watching a king execute a traitor. Camille stood near the kitchen doors, her heart hammering, seeing the man she had tried to save finally stand up to reclaim his house. The calm before was over, the storm had arrived. The silence that followed Wu Jin's revelation was heavy, a physical weight that seemed to press the oxygen out of the room. Marcus stood paralyzed, his mouth working wordlessly like a landed fish, while the affluent diners leaned back in their chairs, their faces pale with the sudden realization that they were witnessing the end of a man's life as he knew it. Wu Jin didn't wait for a confession. He simply tapped a single contact on his high-end device and held it to his ear. Initiate Protocol Blackwood, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The Gilded Anchor. All servers, all terminals. Now. The effect was instantaneous. Throughout the restaurant, the soft amber glow of the digital tablets and point-of-sale terminals flickered and died, replaced by a searing, scrolling wall of red diagnostic code. The rhythmic clinking of the kitchen stopped as the industrial appliances, linked to the central hub, hissed into an emergency lockdown. The house music cut out, leaving only the sound of Marcus's ragged, shallow breathing. Suddenly, the heavy glass front doors didn't hiss, they burst open. A team of men in dark, tactical suits with Han Global Security emblazoned in silver across their chests moved into the foyer with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a scalpel. They didn't look at the diners, they didn't even look at the standing man whose arms were no longer crossed, but trembling at his sides. They moved straight for the manager's office and the server room behind the bar. Marcus finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a desperate shriek. You can't do this. This is a private establishment. I'll have you arrested for. For what, Marcus? Wu Jin stood up slowly, the ragged fabric of his jacket no longer hiding the terrifying presence of the man inside. He loomed over the manager, a titan in the skin of a laborer. For seizing my own servers? For protecting my own assets? I am Han Wu Jin. I don't need a warrant to enter a house that I built. The lead security officer emerged from the back, holding a small, glowing hard drive. He gave Wu Jin a curt nod. The transfer was intercepted, sir. The $1 million fee has been frozen in transit. We have the logs, the IP addresses, and the encrypted keys. Marcus's knees finally gave out. He slumped against the host stand, the very symbol of his power now a mere prop for his collapse. The diners watched as the man they had admired for his exclusivity was stripped of every ounce of authority in less than 60 seconds. Camille watched from the shadows, her hand over her heart, realizing that the system hadn't just crashed, it had been dismantled by the very man it tried to humiliate. The power in the room had shifted for good, and for the first time in years, the air in the Gilded Anchor felt clean. The chaos of the raid settled into a heavy, respectful stillness as the Han Global Security team formed a living corridor between the kitchen and the exit. Han Woojin stood at the center of the room, no longer a rugged immigrant in tattered clothes, but a titan whose shadow seemed to stretch across the entire harbor. He reached up, wiping a streak of dock grime from his cheek with the back of his hand, his eyes scanning the room. The affluent diners who had laughed at him now looked away, shamed by the sudden weight of his presence. Marcus was led out in silence, his wrists bound in plastic ties, his face a mask of ruined ambition. As the doors closed behind him, Woojin turned toward the kitchen. Camille stood there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the neat lines of her uniform a stark contrast to the storm that had just passed. She looked at him, not with the fear the others showed, but with the same quiet composure she had held when she thought he was a man with nothing. Woojin walked toward her, his heavy boots echoing on the marble. He stopped just inches away and reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. This time, he didn't pull out a phone or a single dollar bill. He withdrew a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored parchment, embossed with the Han Global seal. "You risked everything tonight for a stranger who offered you nothing but $1, Woojin said, his voice resonant and clear. You saw the truth when everyone else chose to be blind. He placed the paper on her service tray. It wasn't a bill, and it wasn't a tip. It was a formal executive contract. Camille's eyes widened as she scanned the lines, Director of Portside Operations. Beneath the title, a clause was highlighted in bold, a dedicated endowment fund, moving the recovered millions directly into the Johnson Community Center. The Gilded Anchor needs a soul, Camille. And my company needs a conscience, Woojin continued, his gaze softening. This isn't a reward. It's an appointment. You told me the air was heavy tonight. I think it's time we let some fresh air in. Camille looked from the contract to the man who had built the ships that defined her horizon. The debt that had crushed her spirit for months evaporated in a single heartbeat. She didn't cry, she simply straightened her shoulders, her authoritative grace finally finding its true purpose. I accept, Mr. Han, she said, her voice steady and proud. Woojin nodded, a faint, rare smile touching his lips. He turned to the room, his voice carrying the finality of a new era. The Gilded Anchor is closed for restructuring. We will reopen when we learn that dignity is the only currency that matters. As he walked out into the cool night air of the docks, Camille stood at the threshold, the contract held firmly in her hand. The tide had turned, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't just watching the ships come in, she was the one guiding them home.